All right, I'm going to go ahead and start. Welcome, everybody. My name is Ron Kopel. I think most of you would know me, not everybody here. This evening, you probably just saw the announcement just a minute ago. This evening's program is being recorded. Scott has muted the participants, so when it's time for you to share or at some point, you're welcome to unmute yourself. This is our program, actually our last program for the season from the Tzedek committee on this topic. In terms of, I never thought of it that way, a little bit of a contrarian thinking process. Our guest tonight is Hank Kopel, and that's spelled K-O-P-E-L. I'm absolutely convinced, well, it's pronounced the same as my name, I'm convinced that if Hank and I could get onto finding your roots with Henry Louis Gates, he could probably find a common ancestor some 500 to 800 years ago. But in any case, the topic this evening it's really about, well, the title is Incitement, Genocide, and Terrorism. And it's really based on the fact that so often we hear, and this is focused on the Middle East, although I'll let Hank cover, could be a lot more area than that. But focusing on the Middle East just for a second, it's a belief that's what's causing the terrorist activity against Israel, the hatred. And sometimes there's a common thought that it's colonialism, and it's Western aggression, and it's blowback from poverty, et cetera, et cetera. And Hank is going to speak and talk about his book, which we will definitely show everyone before we're done, that it's really much more than that. It's much different than that. And he'll also discuss what can be done about it, what we as liberal democracies are doing about it. So on that note, Hank, if you could unmute yourself, please, and take it from here, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ron. And I want to thank everybody on the Beth Tikva Social Justice Committee. I'll add, Ron, I think I need to send you my 23andMe data, and we'll see where that ancestor lies. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here. And I thank folks for coming. These aren't the easiest topics. They're pretty heavy, yet I think they do have meaning and impact for our world. So with your grace, I'm going to go to the share screen and put up a PowerPoint through which I'd like to address and explain the book. And it takes about 35 minutes. And then I look forward to a very active Q&A. Please do feel free to challenge me. These are controversial subjects and they need to be fleshed out thoroughly. We are here today, 78 years since the liberation of the Nazi death camps. Pardon me, I think this, I can make sure that this is, there we go. We are here today, 78 years since the liberation of the Nazi death camps, and a world still pledging and still failing to make never again a reality. In fact, since World War II, there have been at least 37 subsequent genocides around the world. Similarly, 20 plus years after 9/11, we inhabit a world still fighting and still failing to win a global war against terrorism. In fact, since 9/11, the world has witnessed well over 10,000 more such terrorist attacks. These invite the question, just what are we missing in our efforts to stop genocide and terrorism? That question was my reason for writing the book, War on Hate. The book actually makes a very simple claim, namely, most discussions of genocides and terrorism misdiagnose their causes. For instance, conventional wisdom says that the root cause of genocides is ancient hatreds, but in fact, throughout history, rival ethnic groups mostly live next door to each other in peace, with genocide being the rare exception. Similarly, conventional wisdom says that the root cause of terrorism is poverty and the resulting desperation. But in fact, studies of terrorists show that most score well above average for both income and education levels. In addition, several opinion polls have shown that support for terrorism is much less among lower income people and much greater among higher income groups. So that invites the question, what really causes genocides and terrorism? War on Hate demonstrates that while the causes are multiple, the central trigger is this: mass, ideological, hate indoctrination, which raises the question, how do we know this? And I respectfully submit we know it at least from three powerful sets of facts, each one supported by an abundance of historical and social science evidence, which the book discusses. Here's the first fact set. Virtually every genocide and terror campaign is preceded and accompanied by a massive deluge of us versus them hate propaganda, which targets the eventual victims. This is true from the Jew-hating propaganda across Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, to the radio and newspapers in Rwanda, which spewed hatred of the Tutsi people in the run-up to the Rwandan genocide. It's true of Hezbollah, with their TV studios in Beirut, and Al-Qaeda and Islamic State's online propaganda of hatred, constantly spewing hatred of Jews, Christians, Israel, and the Western democracies. History shows that this same pattern of mass hate propaganda precedes all of these episodes of mass killing, and some genocidal and terrorist leaders all behave as if mass hate propaganda is a central tool for committing their mass killing. Now here's the second fact set. The vast majority of perpetrators of both genocide and terrorism consist of ordinary people, people who lack any distinctive psychological pathologies or violent propensities. Study after study of these perpetrators all reach this conclusion. Professor James Waller, author of the book Becoming Evil, puts it this way, quote, "Perpetrators of genocide and mass killing are not that fundamentally different from you and me. Significantly, this means the perpetrators were not born that way. Rather, they are made and shaped by circumstances in their environment, which leads to the third crucial set of facts, namely, several psychology laboratory experiments from recent decades have proven that the core features of the perpetrator mindset, that is, the readiness to conduct mass killing, is easily triggered in ordinary people. And here's the key, it's triggered by the same mechanisms used in mass hate campaigns. Each of those experiments exposed its human subjects to psychological triggers that precisely replicate the common features of mass hate campaigns, such things as, among others, assigning people to in-groups and out-groups and seeing how they reacted, surrounding people with false information and seeing how that shaped their thinking, directing people to punish innocent others and seeing what they actually did. Each of these many experiments activated and magnified several features of this perpetrator mindset, which includes things like the following, among many others. Our very strong bias that favors members of our own groups and disfavors members of other groups. A very strong inclination to adopt the false beliefs expressed by a majority of close friends and colleagues, especially opinions about people outside our own groups. The strong tendency to become more extreme in our beliefs whenever we discuss them with others who already agree with us, and our readiness to inflict great suffering upon others if for some perceived greater good, especially if to protect our group against outside threats, whether those threats are real or imagined. The most famous of these experiments you've probably heard about, the so-called shock learner experiments of Yale professor Stanley Milgram in the early 1960s. Milgram directed his human laboratory subjects to administer a memory quiz to another person, the so-called learner. And for any wrong answer, Milgram told the subject to zap the learner with an electric shock. It was actually wired up to an electric machine, and to make the shock stronger for each next wrong answer. Now, there was not a real shock. The learner was just acting shocked, but the lab subjects didn't know that. And yet, they kept giving shocks even after the learner was screaming in agony, begging to be released. Again, these were ordinary people from all walks of life in a haven. They weren't psychopaths at all. In sum, this and several other experiments demonstrate the power of mass hate propaganda to trigger our hardwired propensities for extreme violence and cruelty, especially when it's linked up with a sense of tribal identity. I'll note also, unlike the controlled setting of a psych lab, real hate incitement campaigns, they operate 24/7 for years, not just a brief hour in a psych lab. They activate the whole population, all one's friends, relatives, neighbors, not just a few lab subjects, and all driven to hate in just the same way. Try to imagine for a moment how hard it would be to resist this absolute tidal wave of hatred feared by everybody you know, pressed by everybody you know that you think the same way. Now, note further that there is also compelling real-world evidence that demonstrates this causal link between hate propaganda and mass killing. It comes primarily from studies in the region of the world known as MENA, M-E-N-A, for Middle East North Africa. That's the MENA region. Here's two important sets of facts that can be drawn from studies of this region. First, case studies of the MENA countries, unfortunately, tragically, show that this region manifests by far the highest levels of mass hate indoctrination on the planet. This is abundantly documented in many sources. For instance, Middle East Media Research Institute, so-called MEMRI. This is a free, open online database. You can Google and go into it right now. Thousands of examples of the horrific hate propaganda that courses through Middle East media and education programs are documented on this website. Several books have gathered this data as well. You may have heard of Robert Wistrich, who wrote the magnum opus, A Lethal Obsession, A History of Anti-Semitism. His book's filled with these examples. Neil Kressel's The Sons of Apes and Pigs, a phrase often applied to Jews in some of these countries. His book does that. My own book in chapter 6 assembles several examples from 5 Middle Eastern countries. All of these sources graphically document the MENA countries flood their schools and media with such propaganda messages as these: hatred of Israel in America, claims that Israel and the CIA were the real perpetrators of 9/11, accusations that Jews and Israelis poison the Muslims' food and water supplies, and the so-called blood libel, namely that the Jews kidnap and torture Muslim children to drain their blood and use it in religious rituals. Robert Wistrich, from that magnum opus, A Lethal Obsession, sums up the state of play over there this way, quote, "A culture of hatred permeates the books, magazines, newspapers, sermons, the internet, television, and radio in the Arab Middle East that has not been seen since the heyday of Nazi Germany." Now, along with those facts, consider this set of facts. The MENA countries also reflect the world's highest levels of terrorism. According to the world's largest non-governmental terrorism database hosted at the University of Maryland, of the top 10 countries impacted by terrorism in recent years, in 2014, 6 of the top 10 were from the MENA region, including 4 of the top 5. Next year, 7 of the top 10, and the next year, 8 of the top 10. And there's even more compelling evidence by way of example from this region in a certain subsection known as the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. This evidence comes from the years specifically between the 1993 signing of the Oslo agreements and the Palestinian Authority's rejection of a generous two-state peace offer in the early 2000s, followed by the launching the so-called Second Intifada. During this time, the hate propaganda that's been documented from those territories truly is exemplified as the highest in the world. I'm just going to give you a teeny few examples. It's a tip of the iceberg. In the Q&A, I can give you references that document this further. Palestinians in those years, and sadly still today, wake up every morning to these kind of headlines within their daily government newspaper. Massacre is the basis of the state of Israel. The Jew is the disease of the century. Israelis are the new Nazis. And there's more. Your Israelis, Jews are the ones who crucified Jesus. Jews are crucifying the modern Jesus in the form of the Palestinian Authority. On and on and on it goes. It's so intense that sadly, when it comes time for civic ceremonies in many cities in the Palestinian territories, it is not uncommon for parents to dress their little children in the uniforms of suicide bombers. Look at that little boy on the right. He can't be more than 2.5 years old, dressed by his parents as if to pull the plug, blow himself to bits to mass murder a bunch of Jews. When you wonder why there's no sustainable peace with respect to this issue, these photos may offer some clues. And not only do they do this celebratory with the little kids, when someone has successfully pulled off a suicide bombing or a similar attack and lost their life, this is a source of extraordinary celebration across the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I'm going to step back and talk about my youth too many years ago. I'm a guy in my mid-60s. A lot of folks that age remember when we were kids, we used to trade things called baseball cards with pictures of our favorite baseball heroes like Frank Robinson, Roger Maris, Mickey Mantle, etc. Well, they have something like that in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but instead of sports heroes, it's suicide bomber cards, so-called martyr cards. Every time one of these things happen, they print up in the thousands these cards. They pass them out to the family. They hang them on the walls of shops. They glorify them as the ultimate heroes of the society. Very, very tragic stuff. Now, compare that set of statistics that set of information with this set of statistics. Namely, these territories of those years had the world's highest level of terrorism within their borders. A brilliant economist from Princeton, no longer with us, named Alan Kruger, wrote a brilliant book called What Makes a Terrorist. Among many other things he did in the book, he calculated the per capita rate of terrorist attacks in all the leading terrorist victimized countries of the world. Here's the list of the top 6. Not only did the West Bank and Gaza Strip top the list, it beat the number 2 country, Sierra Leone, by a factor of almost 4. Beat the number 6 country, Colombia, which we know is riven with terrorism from drug gangs, by a factor of almost 7. This is compelling stuff. So I'll summarize it by saying the causal links between propaganda and terrorism, and between propaganda and genocide, are real, and they're very powerful. Now, all that being said, there are in fact multiple causes of both genocide and terrorism. Let's pause a moment to look at the other causes of genocide. There is a professor at the U.S. Naval Academy named Barbara Harf. She has conducted the world's most advanced, sophisticated study of the multiple causes of genocides. What she did was she identified 5 major risk factors that most closely correlate with the risk of a genocide outbreak. Taken together, those factors predict 74% of the dozens of genocides she studies. Here are the 5 factors. 1, a prior genocide having occurred in the country. 2, autocracy as a form of governance. 3, autarkic isolation, that is, a country mostly closed to trade and contacts with outside parties. 4, ruled by an ethnic minority. And 5, a ruling elite that promotes exclusionary ideologies. Now, for terrorism, there's no single multi-factor study like that, but there are several compelling single-factor studies which have identified these 4 factors as especially likely to result in a terrorist campaign. These 4 factors include repression of civil rights and liberties, widespread corruption generating mass hostility against the government, relative group deprivation across ethnic and religious divides. And what this means is if Group A in a country holds only to its own members the leading economic and status positions in the society and denies them to members of ethnic group or religious group B, you'll often see terrorism from Group B against Group A. And lastly, appeasement. There's a whole book written on this question by Alan Dershowitz, which demonstrates very compellingly that when folks try to appease terrorists with counteroffers, etc., not only does terrorism not decline, it actually tends to go up because it emboldens the terrorists to think they can get more by committing this violence. Now, here's where this gets really interesting. This is probably my favorite part of the book's analysis, because what I took away from all this is illiberalism, illiberal governance itself is a meta risk for genocide and terrorism. Let's look at this. We just saw that 3 of the major non-propagandistic causes of genocides include autocracy, exclusive minorities rule, and exclusivist ideology. And then we saw for terrorism 3 of the non-propagandistic factors that make it likely are repression of civil rights, official corruption, and relative group deprivation. Now, there's one thing that all of these 6 factors have in common, namely, each one negates one of the core elements of liberal democracy. So that invites the question, all right then, does liberal democracy really mean less genocide? The answer is a resounding yes. Several scholars, probably leading among them R.J. Rummel, who did an exhaustive level of statistical studies of mass murders of governments of their own people. His conclusion after he went through all the numbers was the more freedom a people have, the more unlikely the government will murder them. And then the parallel question, does liberal democracy mean less terrorism? Again, the answer is a resounding yes. Several scholars, among them Amichai Magen from the IDC Center in Israel, has found from extensive research, quote, a high-quality democracy is increasingly proving to be the best counter-terror organization known to humanity. At this point, it brings us to the book's ultimate conclusions about terrorism and genocide causation, namely, the 2 of the most significant causes of both genocide and terrorist violence are the following. 1, mass ideological hate incitement, because this is what creates the large number of perpetrators needed to commence and sustain a genocide or terror campaign. And number 2, illiberal, that is oppressive and corrupt political culture, because this is what fosters the intergroup resentments and ideologies of hatred that drive mass hate campaigns. So my causation conclusion of the book is this. If you really want to make never again a reality, And if you really want to see the terrorists defeated, we need to focus and target these two causal vectors in our efforts to stop genocide and terrorism as a country and as the group of liberal democracies that seeks to end this stuff. I briefly want to turn here momentarily to the Middle East, just to point out that the tragedy here is that the Middle East measures the highest in all these risk factors of different regions of the world, not only as far as mass hate propaganda, which we've already discussed, but also you'll see that this is the world's most unfree region, most oppressively governed region. A group called the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. annually publishes a Human Freedom Index. Here's the map of their evidence from the year 2020, and the prior and subsequent years are pretty similar. All right, here on the map, the dark green are the freest governed countries in the world. The palest green are the least free, most oppressively governed countries in the world. The gray ones, there's just not enough data. Look at the Middle East. There you see it, one of the most unfree, oppressively governed regions of the world. Now look at corruption. There is a group called Transparency International. They do global surveys every year called the Global Corruption Perception Index. They put the data together in this index. Here's their map from 2020. The least corrupt places in the world are in the yellow or the orange. The most corruptly governed places in the world are in the red, especially the dark red. Look at the Middle East. Again, we see one of the most corruptly governed places in the world. So leading the world in mass hate propaganda, in unfreedom and oppressiveness, and in corruption. No wonder this region produces among the highest levels of terrorism and mass killing on the planet. Now, here's where it gets difficult, and this is where my book is especially contrarian. Because unfortunately, the several facts that I've outlined in the last 20 minutes in these chapters of the book, they often fall on deaf ears in the places where I would say it matters most, namely our national security agencies across Europe, among political and opinion leaders, and in academia and the think tanks. Much to the detriment of our national security and the lives of millions, I would say, our leaders display almost a kind of willful blindness towards both the tsunami of hate propaganda across the Middle East and the level of illiberal and corrupt governance structures that drive this propaganda. I'm just going to cite a few representative examples. We'll just go tip of the iceberg here. There's plenty more in the book you can find. But first, take a look at our national security agency and ask yourself if they're dealing squarely with the reality as it is. In 2010, the White House's chief terrorism advisor declared that there was a new U.S. policy. We're going to work with Hezbollah's, quote, moderate elements. Now, without belaboring the point, Hezbollah, if you look at the charter and look at what they do, they are committed, literally, not figuratively, to the extermination of every last Jew on the planet. And they're unwavering in that commitment. There's no other wing that says we're not going to do that. This is impossibly to be described as having moderate elements. They just don't exist. In 2011, the Director of National Intelligence declared that the Muslim Brotherhood was a, quote, largely secular organization. Now, anyone who studied the Muslim Brotherhood knows it was founded in 1928 with the express mission, which it adheres to very fastidiously today, of ultimately having as its goal the creation of a global caliphate in which everyone will be required to be of the Muslim faith, no exceptions, no other faith. How this can be described as largely secular by a high national security official, it just boggles my mind. In 2015, the CIA director declared, this is a public statement, it's documented in the press, that the Islamic State, the horrific genocidal Islamic State is, quote, not Islamic. Now, he didn't say what I would agree with, that they distort Islam, they're perverting Islam. No, he said they're not Islamic. This is a real reality problem. In 2016, there was a meeting between President Obama and Francois Hollande, the then president of France, to talk about the Syrian civil war and what we can do about it. They each made a statement, as they do after these meetings. The official audio tape cut out Francois Hollande's reference to Islamist terrorism. It was like Voldemort in the Harry Potter stories. You can't say that. Don't say it. They were actually called on it by some members of the press and eventually admitted, yeah, that they claimed it was a technical error, but they put it right back in and it was right there. This isn't just something that's about words and public relations. This has consequences. And by way of example, there was a terrible consequence in 2009 of this kind of willful blindness. But before I get to that, I'll just note one more study. In 2012, Congressman Louis Gohmert from Texas made a presentation calling out this practice. He titled it Disappearing Language. This is what he did. He took 3 of the nation's leading security agencies' counterterrorism documents, the 9/11 report, which came out in 2004, the FBI's list of counterterrorism terminology, which was published in 2008, and the annual National Intelligence Survey for 2009. What Gomer did was he had a staff go through these reports and have them count the number of times various words appeared in the reports. There were many more than these three here, jihad, Muslim, and Islam, but you get the picture. All right, here's the 9/11 report. Between 126 and 300 plus times, these words were mentioned. What happened in 2008? Zero. Don't say jihad, don't say Muslim, don't say Islam. Again, nobody's advocating the stereotyping of entire religious community. That's not what this is about. But if there is a massive terrorism coming from this part of the world of certain professed adherents of a certain faith, you don't get anywhere to solving the problem if you can't even talk about it. 2009, how about a year later? Same thing, zero. You cannot talk about this stuff in many sectors of government now, and that probably impairs our ability to fight it. So as I said, this has consequences. You probably remember an event in 2009 at Fort Hood, Texas, an Army major, Army psychiatrist, Nadal Hassan. He opened fire on the base, murdering 12, wounding 31 of his fellow soldiers, leaving them terribly maimed and wounded. Now, the problem here was his proclivities were no secret in the years leading up to this attack. Senator Joe Lieberman and Senator Susan College published a joint report for the U.S. Senate called The Ticking Time Bomb. And in this report, they included facts such as this. For years before the shooting, Nadal Hassan had been declaring his radical Islamist beliefs, quote, at every opportunity. That's what his colleagues in the Army said to the testifying commission. He called the war on terror a war on Islam. He defended Osama bin Laden to his Army colleagues. Yet, his annual reviews omitted any mention of his clearly stated, often announced radical tendencies. Even when he committed the shooting and it was done, and the bodies were being cleaned out, the government did not call this massacre terrorism. They called it workplace violence. There is a function of denial going on here that is very powerful. Go to Europe and you'll see similar things happening. There are European leaders, true liberal leaders, who have often called for resolving some of their terrorism and inequality problems by making sure we're more integrated as a society. Bring our Muslim co-citizens in to the economy and to the society so they're more part of France, Britain, Germany, or wherever. For just calling for integration, something which my parents marched on this behalf with the inspiration of Martin Luther King, 40, 50 years ago. Fritz Bolkenstein, the leader of the Dutch Liberal Party, was declared a racist and an Islamophobe and denounced. Pim Fortuyn, a self-described gay Marxist who was running for president of the Netherlands, made the same claim. We need to integrate our fellow Muslim citizens. This will help a lot of these problems. He was denounced as an Islamophobe, so much so that he was finally murdered on the campaign trail by a self-described vegan activist who said, but he hated Muslims. People from the Islamic community in Europe, who themselves call out the extremism of their co-religionists, have been subject to death threats, shunning, and ostracism. Very hard to do this. Marjee Nawaz, a very brave fellow who was a radical for a time in England, left radicalism and founded a counterterrorism foundation called the Quilliam Foundation. He has many death threats on his life now. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, you've probably heard of her, a brilliant Dutch parliamentarian from Somalia. When she published a film about the abuse of women under radical Islam called Submission, she was subject to so many death threats, she eventually had to leave the country. She lives in America now. This too has consequences, this blindness to this ideology. One example, a terrible example, is from Rotherham, England. In the town of Rotherham, there was a gang consisting of men who themselves and their families had immigrated from Pakistan. They were all of the Muslim faith. They were kidnapping and sex trafficking little girls throughout the city for years. People reported to the police. Even a member of parliament, a Labour member of parliament, asked the police, you've got to investigate this, called it out. When they did that, they were denounced as Islamophobes, as racists, and the police declined to investigate. It was finally revealed when, many years too late, the police finally were pushed to get involved, that over 1,000 little girls had been raped and sexually abused because of the inaction sponsored by the unwillingness to face these realities. So this is very troubling stuff. I'll just briefly touch on the question, so why is this happening? And this actually has a subsection that gets into the I never thought of it that way issue, because here we have a block on thinking going on that's affecting major policy that's relevant to violence prevention. So I actually came up with several identified causes of this willful blindness. I'll just sum them up. One big juncture happened in 1973 with the Arab-Israeli War. As you may remember, the OPEC countries in the Middle East said anyone supporting Israel doesn't get our oil. America, we had enough oil reserves, we could weather the storm. We supported Israel from its annihilation in that war. Europe did not. They did not have the oil reserves. They immediately adopted a very pro-PLO, very anti-Israel stand, which still permeates their politics today. Secondly, Europe had a real terrorism problem in the 1970s. There were a lot of Palestinian terrorist groups in the continent committing murders, chasing down Israelis, Jews, and rival groups, etc. The Europeans, I don't know why, rather than coming up with better law enforcement efforts, cut secret deals. This has been revealed in recent years and documented. Secret deals with the various PLO terror groups, Germany, France, Italy, Switzerland, and others. This was the deals they cut. They've all been revealed now. You can come to our country, you terror groups. You can recruit for raise funds, you can recruit participants, and you can do what you got to do as long as you do not kill our people. And I hate to say it, but the subtext is you go after the Israelis on our soil, no, we're not going to do anything about it. Just don't hit our people. And they would not extradite them. They would not prosecute them. Dirty deals, shameful policy. In America, we have some problems too. There have been hundreds of millions of dollars donated to American colleges and their Middle East studies programs for Middle Eastern countries and billionaires. Over 300 million just in the 14 years, 94 to 08. And the universities that have received those funds have very anti-Israel, very pro-PLO Middle East studies departments. And this is a real problem around the country. That problem is reinforced by an explicit ideological issue, namely, some of you may have heard of the late Palestinian-American scholar at Columbia. He was a professor of English named Edward Said. He wrote a book several decades ago called Orientalism. And the basic theme of his book is this: the problems of the Middle East are not because of any indigenous shortcomings or issues we have to resolve. The problems of the Middle East are all the fault of outside actors, particularly the United States and Israel and their colonialism and their abuse of our societies. And if you were to criticize us about allegedly indigenous problems, whether it's the propaganda, the way we educate our kids, issues of corruption, that's racism. What he called it Orientalism, because they used to call the Middle East the Orient. And this book, unfortunately, has become the text of Middle East studies across the country. This is a view that very rarely is allowed to be challenged in Middle East studies departments. You've probably heard some stories of how this goes at Columbia University. It's very hard to be Jewish or Israeli in that program at Columbia. It's like that around the country. There's also a problem. A lot of academics tend to be very secular, and they don't have sort of the vision and comprehension that people might actually kill other people in what they believe to be a purported religious cause. The tendency is, it must be poverty, must be something the US is doing or Israel's doing. The idea that this ideology could be so strong escapes many scholars. And then you get the process of fear and self-censoring, which we know from things like the fatwa put out by Iran on Salman Rushdie, the death threat that still exists today. I mentioned Ayaan Hirsi Ali, her partner in that film about the abusive woman under Islam in the Netherlands was Theo van Gogh, grandnephew of Vincent van Gogh. He was murdered in the street by a self-described Islamist, put a knife in his chest with a note attached to it that said Ayaan Hirsi Ali is next. That's partly why she left the Netherlands. This is really troubling stuff. And it all leads to what I conclude in the book, a lot of paradigm constraints, cognitive bias. People don't want to talk about certain things for all the reasons I've mentioned. And it reminds me of a quote by a deputy director of the CIA who said this after 9/11, "We cannot see what we were not looking for." And there's a great experiment, which is right on the topic of, I didn't think of it that way, called inattentional blindness. Social psychologist named Dan Simon did this social psych experiment on the phenomenon of what he calls inattentional blindness. And here's what he did. He gathered 6 college students and made a short video. It's like a 2 or 3 minute video, right? And in the video, he has 3 of the students wear white t-shirts and 3 of them wear black t-shirts. He gives them a couple of basketballs and says, just pass the balls as fast as you can. Keep playing catch with the basketball over and over. I'm going to film you for like 2 or 3 minutes. And he did that. Then, having the film in hand, he brings his lab subjects in. And there are other students. And he says, all right, I'm going to show you a video. Here's what I want you to do. Look at the people with the white t-shirts. Count how many times they pass the basketball. He runs the film 2 or 3 minutes, and at the end he says, okay, how many times did the folks with the white shirts pass the ball? And most of the students got something approximating or exactly the right answer. And then he says, what about the gorilla? You say, what? He says, what about the gorilla? Did you see the gorilla? They said, there was no gorilla. What are you talking about? Well, in fact, during the video, this is what happened. A person in a gorilla suit walked right into the middle of the crowd. And the gorilla didn't just pass through. He stopped and starts beating his chest like Tarzan and then walks off. But the students didn't see it because you can't see what you're not looking for. And in my mind, this is a bit metaphoric of the problem we have in our foreign policy vis-a-vis genocide and terrorism and the causation analysis. So with that in mind, I just want to close with some suggestions I make on how to try to overcome this. How can we come up with a policy agenda that might do better at preventing genocide and reducing terrorism? I got a 6-part set of recommendations in the book. I'm just going to buzz through them quickly and we can go to Q&A. First, I recommend a policy of name and shame. We should be mapping this stuff. Who are the conduits? Who are the sponsors? What are the organizations in each country? Is it government? Is it non-government, et cetera? And then we should publicize it. This is where this indoctrination is coming from. This is where they're doing it. This is why people want to get on airplanes with box cutters and fly them into the World Trade Center because of this stuff. Get it out there. And having done that, we can then target our public diplomacy and counter-information campaigns. 4 parts at least. We should challenge the jihad narrative whenever we can with better counter-narratives. This is not a war between 2 or 3 religions or parts of the world, but life is more complex. Let's look at it a different way. We should expose how terrorists harm and kill Muslims. Vastly more people of the Muslim faith in these countries have been killed by terrorism than the Westerners who've been killed by it as well. We should be offering Western education that can open the gates of pluralistic discourse, get people out of the us versus them mindset and into the we mindset and the open information and questioning mindset. And we should be supporting what I call real Islamic reformers. Unfortunately, a lot of Western countries, including us, we tend to support a category of people within the Islamic community who believe this ideology and promote this ideology, but because they don't do direct involvement in the violence, they say, well, we can work with them. We can't, because they're the ones imputing this ideology to the folks who do the violence. And the sad thing is there are millions of reformers within the Muslim community who want a better world, who want an ecumenical life, like what we're seeing with the UAE and Israel and the Abraham Accords. There are a lot more people like that. That's who we should be supporting. And then we should use our economic and law enforcement pressures, of which we're blessed to have a lot if we use it wisely. We should be imposing policies of linkage. You want a foreign aid, Saudi Arabia? Get that junk off your state-sponsored TV and your state-sponsored newspapers if you want our F-16s and you want a technological aid. And sanctions, we should at very least, like under the Magnitsky Act that Congress passed in other contexts, we should be sanctioning all those known to be promoting this incitement and leading it in these other countries. At the extremes, it might be a case where a whole country would have to be boycotted, though that's a rare approach. Lawfare, we should be indicting, extraditing, prosecuting people who are inciting genocide. Incitement to genocide is a big crime under international law and American law. We should pass a law for the same for incitement to terrorism, do the same there. And fourth, there are times we should unleash our hard power. We should be jamming these incitement broadcasts and bombing these incitement conduits in limited situations. Hezbollah has TV and radio studios in Beirut. They broadcast all across Europe to the immigrant Muslim communities, radicalizing them terribly, indoctrinating them in anti-Semitism and hatred of Christians and democracies. Why in the world are we letting that power carry on? And we should be promoting liberalization where we can. Now, we all know there's a big debate about that, and I'm happy to discuss that later because I have a whole section about Iraq in my book. It's not that we should be going around invading countries and setting up bicameral legislatures and American-style courts. Can't do that. What we can do is we can support agents of pluralism and intergroup tolerance around the world. The way I phrase in the book is, you got to install the pluralistic software before you can activate the democratic hardware. This might sound over-idealistic and a little over-interventionist, but you know what? This is exactly what our grandparents did after World War II in Germany and Japan, and that worked pretty well. Lastly, I have to say this, we need to dethrone the dominance of what I call the woke Middle East paradigm in Middle East studies departments around the country. This is the sole way that many students are allowed to approach the Middle East. This book by Ibn Said, Orientalism. As I said before, they labels outsiders' critiques of problems in these countries as racist. It completely inhibits discussion of indigenous problems like hate indoctrination, corruption, and misgovernance, which, by the way, our silence about this isn't helping the citizens of these countries. It's only helping the few elites who hold power and money. But the regular folks are suffering under these regimes. We should be able to talk about that. So I'll conclude by saying this with a quote from someone from 2.5 millennia ago. And the quote is this: "If language be not in accordance with the truth of things, affairs cannot be carried on to success." That's Confucius from ancient China. I would suggest that our job going forward is to bring our language and bring our policy discourse back in accord with the truth of things, and thereby begin to fashion policies that will actually reduce and eliminate these terrible scourges of mass killing. Thank you very much.
Wow, thanks, Hank. There was a lot to take in there, and it was brilliant. Thank you. It was mind racing. I mean, it was just a lot of stuff, very, very fast, very quick. But what I like to do is at this point, and again, thank you, Hank. It was really phenomenal. So much to think about. Questions, Q&A. Right now, you're all muted. And I'm not going to do a whole lot of formal stuff here. We have a lot of folks here, but it's not that many that we can't just simply unmute yourself, raise your hand, wave like I'm waving now, unmute yourself and ask a question. It's always hard to be the ones that go first, but whoever would like to, please go first. Does anybody want to go for it? Okay, Scott, go for it.
Okay, Hank, I was very interested in the statistics you used about comparing the level of terrorism from nation to nation. And I was curious what methodology was used to come up with those statistics.
Sure. Not having been the guy in the front lines who did that, I'll say in the background, everything I do is derivative. I say in my intro, I rely on scholars, statisticians, demographers. They did all the work. I'm just putting it together and putting an interpretation on it. That being said, my understanding, for instance, at the START is the acronym for the University of Maryland Terrorism Program. I can't remember what it stands for. But I believe what they do is they literally make a list of every possible identifiable terrorist act that happens around the world and categorize them by country, region, etc. I think they also include other factors like what kind of attack. Was it a suicide bombing? Was it a shooting? Whatever. They literally just compile a list. I do not know how they assemble the raw data set, but I know that the phrase in national security is OSINT, open special intelligence sources. You know, you can just get off the internet so much information. If you have a team of fact folks monitoring the newspapers and the government reports and so forth, and police reports from institutions around the world, there's a lot you can do without special secretive means. And I think that's what they do. They just compile lists, and the question is, are they being sufficiently exhaustive? My guess would be, I don't think places like the University of Maryland tries to overemphasize one area at the expense of the other. So I think they try to get full access wherever they go, and that's how they compile the list and then create the numbers and then summarize them.
So they're looking at the perpetrators of terrorist events all over the world and trying to figure out the nationality of the perpetrators, and then comparing the number of perpetrators involved to the that country's population.
Well, that's certainly what Alan Kruger did that. He does it per capita in order to equalize in a comparative way countries with small and large and medium population. And Kruger, I tend to trust him very much because he was an economist at Princeton, was actually selected by President Obama to be the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for a time. He's tremendously respected in the field. I would guess that goes with a lot of statistical rigorousness on his part. I don't have the capacity to second guess his figures. I just go for someone who I think, by a lot of indications, they're reliable, and that's why I pulled his stats. His book, What Makes a Terrorist, is fascinating because it's so just objective and full of data from around the world, but he makes it explainable to folks who aren't specialists in the field. It's a wonderful work.
I don't know if everyone caught the screen flash in the chat, or you go back to the chat. Sure, it came from Myrna, but our library, our Temple Library, will secure a copy of Hank's book. so that if you obviously you're welcome to purchase it on your own. And Hank, I believe it's coming out or it has come out in paperback as well now. Can you
Thank goodness
expand on that?
it's now out in paperback because I work with a textbook publisher, great company, Rowman Littlefield. The only drawback is that they use textbook pricing. So the hardback was like 145 initially, paperback's 46, and pretty soon books and all the secondary sellers probably should drop a bit. But yeah, it's available in paperback on Amazon at 46. They deliver it within a day or two.
So that will be available in our Temple library as well. I'm opening it up to anyone else who has any questions. Mark, unmute yourself, please. Unmute. There you go.
Okay. Thanks, Hank. I found it a very interesting talk, what you presented. I want to get your opinion on something that you gave some examples of the things that lead towards terrorism. I think there was both verbal and then there was economic things that did that. So I'll ask this question. I don't know how to phrase it in any other way. Is Israel becoming a terrorist country within the last 6 to 12 months based on the things that are happening there, between the government becoming, in my opinion, illiberal and the hard right people who seem to be terrorizing Jews and Arab and the Palestinians?
Right. Tough question, important issue. And I think all of us, our heart sometimes breaks for Israel if we see it if we perceive it going down an alley that we're hoping it doesn't go down, et cetera. Let me say at the outset, there has been some very troubling rhetoric. I think it's Ben Gvir. Is he head of this new national police force they're trying to set up? They're trying to integrate the police forces under a national administration. And he has said some troubling things, no question. It was either he or one of the other ones who actually seemed to speak with approval at the retaliatory attack in the Palestinian town in the West Bank, where they murdered a couple of folks. That being said, I tend to look at, what's the word for it, practice and behavior. Israel still holds very tightly to, let me put it this way, there's a lieutenant colonel in the British Army by the name of Richard Kemp. I don't know if you all have ever heard of this guy. He's a very interesting fellow. He was the commander of British forces in Afghanistan during the early years of the Afghan war. For some reason, he got connected with, or working with, and getting to know folks in the Israeli military establishment. And he has, at one point, seeing all the denunciation of Israel in the global press for when it has flare-ups with Hamas in Gaza or Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, he did a study of Israel's war tactics. And his conclusion was that there is no country on the face of the earth, including the United States and Britain, that has as ethical a military as Israel, that they do the most of any country in the world to avoid collateral harms to civilians. They do the most to always authorize their officers and enlisted men that at any time, if they're told to go and attack a target, and they believe that their attack is at risk of hurting civilians who shouldn't be hurt, they have authority always to disobey the orders without fear of punishment. So there have been bombing runs sent out with the Israeli, the Air Force men in the planes will refuse to drop the bombs because they say too much risk to civilians. And so I think that's important to lay out as a context, that in other words, the country has a deep spirit of, and I'm sure it comes from Jewish experience, ethics, the Holocaust, et cetera. We are not going to become brutes when we have power to defend ourselves. It's a very strong ethic. I think that still holds. That being said, I think a lot of us can debate what's happening in Israel now. I'm less alarmist than your question suggests about Israel, even though I recognize that there were some really problematic folks in the government now who a lot of us would say it's not the kind of person you want in the ministry in the government anyway, and I get that. I think, though, that Israel's controversy has more to do with the details of the court and less to do with how they're going to continue policing, how they're going to continue enforcing order as best they can in the West Bank and dealing with Gaza. In other words, I don't think the disputes in Israel go to as much law enforcement and counterterrorism. I think they go to the role of the court and the balance of powers between the Knesset, the court, and the prime minister. And I'm happy to get into a discussion of that because I've been trying to study that issue lately. But I'm less convinced Israel's losing its special spirit and elan as an ethical country when it has to go to war. Happy to take follow-up, and I'm happy to be corrected on this. If folks think I'm missing something, I mean, we all care about this. Tell me where I'm wrong. Happy to hear it.
Okay, so I'll continue with to another part of my question, which is, and again, based on how you presented your data, and I guess say I tend to agree with you about Israel. I'm concerned about it because of what I see the right-wing groups doing. I'm hoping that the bulk of the country won't go down that path. I don't think it will, but when I look at how you presented it, they seem to be following in those steps. So then my next question is, what are the chances in the United States when I look at what's going on right now with a significant fraction, especially of Congress, willing to back Marjorie Taylor Greene, who says things like, besides the Jewish space lasers, but then says, she supports not a spy, but a traitor who goes out, and because she's white, Christian, and male, it's perfectly okay for him to do what he did. And
Yeah.
we're not getting a lot of pushback from our political leaders.
It's very concerning. I agree. And I think probably everyone who's taken the time to tune into a discussion like this, I'm guessing we all share huge concern about the polarization abroad in the country. And we probably come at it from a variety of different ways, but I think we share the wish that, here's the way I look at it. The guardrails on what I would call good democratic discourse, where we fight hard but fair, where we fight over the issues, and at the end of the day, we go home and say, we're all Americans. Those guardrails have been coming down for years and years. And I haven't done the analysis like I tried to do in the book. Why are people blind to this? Here's 5 or 6 causes. I haven't yet tried to figure out what are the causes of the guardrails coming down and the often appalling nature of our discourse and polarization. I have some theories about it. I think they have in part to do with how hard it's been for people in the middle and lower than middle economic classes as compared with people in more upper middle classes economically and culturally. Someone used a phrase with me once that really resonated. He said, the split in America today is between people for whom globalization has been a wind at their backs and those for whom globalization has been a gale force wind in their faces. I think there's some truth to that. And I think whenever times get tough and it feels more zero sum in the economy, things get more bitter. I think we're at risk of losing some of our liberal small L ways of dealing with each other. I want to see the guardrails back up. I want to see a discourse where we go home at the end of the day and says, but we're all Americans. We're all brothers and sisters, even where we disagree. I can't tell you what the future holds, but I'll tell you the kind of people I put my hope in. Have you all ever heard of Jonathan Haidt and Heterodox Academy? He's a guy who's a social scientist who's written a fabulous book about polarization called, and I'm forgetting the title, it's on my shelf and I quoted in my book, but Haidt and several folks from the center left and the center right have gotten together to say, we got to put the guardrails of how to discuss things in democracy back up. And they'll host people from different parts of the political spectrum, but it's always a respectful discussion. And they try to say, hey, maybe there's something I can learn from this, even when I disagree from them. And so look up Heterodox Academy online. They're fabulous, and they're trying to bring back democracy the way it's supposed to be done. And people doing that, I think that's where it's at. The other thing I'd add on this thing of where's America going, I don't mean to ramble too much. My wife and I were in New Haven, Connecticut. She's a physician. I was for many years a federal prosecutor. It's a classic American city. You deal with all kinds of people in your day-to-day life. You're not in a bubble. And our impression when my wife and I talk about this at the kitchen table is among the politically engaged who are at the center of that stuff and the activists, things are really bitter. But when you talk to day-to-day folks, it still seems to me like people want to get along, regardless of your color, your religion, or lack of religion, or whatever. It's kind of like, hey, buddy, how you doing? Thank you, man. Can I hold the door for you? I still see a lot of that. The problem is the activist and the political discourse is kind of overwhelming the sound of folks who just want to get along. I don't know. I hope I'm not too optimistic there.
Hank, well, first of all, first of all, this has been great. I'm so glad we were able to secure your presence here this evening. I always shoot for the stars, so I actually tried to get an email to Dr. Jonathan Haidt to bring him into this group, but that's shooting for the stars. I mean, and I'm not in any way denigrating your being here, but I'm telling you, I went for the big one on that one. But unfortunately,
He's above my pay grade.
Yeah, I didn't get a response on that one. I will get a plug in for another group you may or may not be familiar with, which is Better Angels. And they're more online, and they are totally dedicated to bringing discussions in basically very structured. Actually, they were kind of the genesis of my doing this, although they're far more sophisticated. But they bring groups together for discussions from the far right and the far left and the middle, of course. But they make it very structured, so you can't call anybody a bad name or anything like that. You have to talk through the moderators. You can't talk to each other. But they do a great job of doing the same thing you described, which is attempting to stop this. If I know what I know, and if you disagree with me, then you're obviously stupid. And I'm seeing a lot of that every day, and it really upsets me.
Yes.
So they're also somebody who is trying to get away from that as well. Are there any other questions?
Yes, Ron.
Myrna,
Yeah,
Yes.
okay, thank you. Go, guys.
That what you were doing is bringing up what I wanted to do. That's very frustrating. And we always should lead with an action item. What can we as individuals do to help the discussion to ameliorate this kind of thing that's going on? What can we do?
Wow, I'm definitely outside any claimed scholarly expertise in that, but I appreciate the question because I think virtually or totally everybody here probably has thought the same thing. I'd love to hear. I wish you had time where we could all put a thought on the table and whiteboard it and then pull the best ones, you know. I do think one thing, and I say this more as a parent who struggles to be the kind of parent I want to be with kids, modeling for others, you know, hearing a point of view different than oneself and trying to say, I don't know if you've heard of David Bernstein. He's very active in Jewish affairs nationally, who just wrote a book critical of what he calls the more woke kind of stuff that tends to be anti-Israel. But he says, but he's still trying to have discussions with people who disagree with him. And he says, I often phrase it as, I don't think I think about it that way. And I know on my own things, I have some folks I know who we totally disagree, but we're friends, you know, and I'll say, I think I see what's happening. I think your analysis of the facts is X on that point, and my analysis of the facts is Y. If I thought the facts were X, I think I'd go the way you're going, but because I think they're Y, I go in a different way. Or because I think the causal analysis, like I tried to in the book, like if someone talks about what's the causes of poverty, what's the causes of criminality, what's the causes of violence, depending on how we differently describe what's driving it, that affects what policies and politicians we might tend to support. And so I try to use those discussions, one, try to be respectful, and two, I'm upfront. I says, yeah, I view it a different way. Here's some reasons why. And I try to engage folks with, let's find out why it is we differ. Let's find out where the point of disagreement really is at its root. That's one thing. And the other thing is, just like when I have an opportunity here, I tend to speak favorably about groups like Jonathan Haidt and, you know, Better Angels. And there's a lot of groups like that out there in the country. And I just try to get their word out. You know, that's the kind of thing. But I'm open to suggestion. I'd love to hear what other folks think on that one.
Okay,
Oh.
I don't, again, I want to make sure, Mickey, you're on.
Yeah, I have a question. I don't know if this is pertinent to what you were discussing, but in the Middle East, and you even mentioned Bahrain, you know, there is the Abraham Accord. And Bahrain, I think, was one of the countries that is part of that. And I'm just wondering what your opinion is about that, if you think that's going to kind of cool the temperature, you know, with what's going on with the Abraham Accords, is that going to kind of cool the temperature among countries? But yet at the same time, you now have Saudi Arabia, who was just decided to reach out to Iran and try to make amends there. And how does that affect the Abraham Accord? That's
a really important question. Again, I think a lot of folks say, I know my household, when we saw the Abraham Accords being signed and see the way it was being carried forward, we were almost in tears, because until then, there had not been any war and peace with Israel and another Middle Eastern country. The Egypt peace is very cold. Egypt still, as my book shows, blasts the Jew-hating propaganda like crazy on the media. Same thing in Jordan. They're very cold. So we say pieces by countries who feel we can't get rid of Israel by war, and so we might as well cut a deal to be able to move on and do whatever we got to do as a country. This is totally different, the Abraham Accords. There is a sense of cousinly identification with the descendants of Abraham, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish. It's fabulous. There are probably strong opinions on either side of this, or different sides of this. I tend to adhere to one type of analysis. My guy on this, when it comes to trying to figure out what's going on, is Michael Doran. He's a scholar at the Hudson Institute in Washington. He's been in policy positions in and out. And he writes oftentimes for Mosaic magazine, which is published by the Tikva Fund online. And Michael Doran's analysis, and I read other folks too, but I find him particularly lucid on what's America doing vis-a-vis the Abraham Accords, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and so forth. Because we all know the Middle East is now split between the Sunni Arab countries of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, etc., which tend to be more toward dealing with Israel. They all feel totally threatened by Iran. They're terrified that Iran's going to get nukes. And you got Iran and its allies, Hezbollah, Syria, which are more the Shia Muslim rather than the Sunni Muslim side. Anyways, Duran's view is that, unfortunately, and I don't like to get political here, is that President Obama and now President Biden, their core framework for analyzing the Middle East is, we can cut a deal with Iran that will allow America to pull back and not be spending so much time and money in the Middle East. And the way to do that is to empower Iran to become the regional balancer against Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, etc., and the UAE. And Duran's view, which is one I tend to incline to it, is that you really can't cut a deal with Iran because their leadership is so radical and vis-a-vis Israel exterminatory. There's just no room. There's no possibility of a compromise that we would find morally acceptable. Whereas those folks like Mike Pompeo and others who are much more toward building an Israeli Sunni Arab axis, the UAE, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, I think that's a more viable approach. The more we push some kind of relationship closer with Iran, the more we undermine the Abraham Accords. The more we go back toward confronting Iran with sanctions and a challenge, the more we bring Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt together in a bloc, because all of them feel threatened by Iran. It is my understanding that when the Biden administration came in, they actually canceled the multi-country investment fund that was supposed to fertilize and grow the Abraham Accords. They stopped spending on that. And so I think that was a gesture to Iran, because I think the feeling was, we can pull Iran into our orbit, we'll solve the Middle East problem. I don't think you can with Iran, but that's what I would say. You either have to go with Iran and its allies, or Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the Sunni Arab countries, and it's really hard to get a mixing of the two. Just one guy's opinion. And I think that's why Saudi Arabia is now trying to cut some deal with Iran. We've kind of left them hanging there, and that's difficult.
Wow. I don't want to cut off discussion. If anybody else would like to wave and turn on your mic or whatever. If not, I'm looking around. I don't see anything further. So what I like to do is a couple of thank yous. The number one thank you is Hank. Honest to gosh, this has been really phenomenal. And I really, really appreciate this very much. We are closing out the season for this program. I mentioned this at the onset. I don't conduct these programs during the summer because I don't know about you guys, but I don't do Zoom calls June, July, and August on a summer evening. So we'll see what we're going to do again next year. But Hank, thanks for a wonderful program. Scott, before I do the final thank yous, I'll toss it to you as our chairman, if you'd like to just share a goodbye or a thank you or anything else.
Oh, I just want to thank Ron for organizing.
thank
I
you.
never thought of it that way. It's been a wonderful series. And I want to
Appreciate
thank everybody who tuned in tonight for it. And I look forward to more programs like this in the future.
Yeah, thank you. That's very kind of you, Scott. But as everyone can imagine, I couldn't do this by myself. That just wouldn't be possible. Scott is our chairman. I very much appreciate everything you've done for me. There's a couple of other people. Well, first of all, I couldn't do any of this stuff without Ronnie Bender. I mean, that's just goes without saying. She gets me through all of this. Tonight's program, particularly, I want to thank Mark Chasen, because he's the one that brought us together with Hank. And so that is something I really do appreciate. Anybody else? Okay, I will go ahead. I go ahead. I recognize.
All right, we don't know each other, but what a great session. Well done, Hank.
Oh, thank you.
Proud brother moment if you haven't figured that out.
Okay.
Is this recording going to be on your YouTube channel, or
All
is
right.
that possible, or what?
Scott will answer that
Yeah,
question.
Beth Tikva has a YouTube channel, and we will try to get it up there. I've had a little struggle in the past, but I think we can do it.
And Ronnie will put something out with the link to the recording for tonight for all who attended. So you will get something on that in terms of the recording. And then I want to just end it up with this. Thank you all for coming here tonight. Have a great evening and be well. Thank you all very much. Good night.
Thank you, Ron, so much, and everybody. It's wonderful.
Thank you, Hank.
Yes.